The exhibition title is Amarantus, which comes from a word in Greek that means flower that never dies. Amarantus is also a seed that is used in many different cultures, but in Mexico it was widely used as food, but also as a ritual food that they will use to make figures that they would also eat, and they were part of the ceremony. From one side, I work with historical material, where I take objects that are usually in museum collections or are in libraries or are in research institutes, and these objects are taken out of their original context, so somehow they are dead. But through the stories that they tell and through researching, like where are they coming and which are the things that are related to them, you can make these objects alive again. So this metaphor of Amarantus speaks about the objects that never die, because through the stories we can keep them alive and continue to understand what they mean. Yeah, the second aspect of Amarantus, which is related to the food that was eaten in Mexico, and they were all these figures that were made representing different gods or goddesses, and they were also eaten during these rituals. And this aspect of object that becomes part of your metabolism, that becomes part of your body, is also very important in the exhibition.
The main problem was that the machine changed its codes every day and sent a new message every time. The team had to work flat out to crack the codes.
Also, the sequence of the exhibition, the way everything is arranged, is not chronological. So there are works that are from the last 15 years, but I decided to transform the space in each specific room in the museum. So it's more about an experience where you see different transitions of materials, of stories, also on the architecture of the museum itself. So you go through all these transitions, but it's not chronological. It has more to do with the experience of the exhibition. The work we are standing now is part of a series called Hypothesis of a Tree. It's a series of works that are trying to understand the diagrams that are made to understand evolution. So how all the different species are related in a timeline. So Darwin was the first one who made a phylogenetic tree, but this has been evolving now drastically, especially now with all the genetic phylogenetic trees, which are different from the ones that use fossils as analog material. So this project was trying to understand how the scientists decide the relationship between the different species. So it's not so easy, and there's always a lot of negotiations. That's why the series is called Hypothesis of a Tree, because these trees are constantly changing. And in this case, I worked at the Natural History Museum in Berlin, where I developed a smaller phylogenetic tree. Is just from the oldest fish they had to the first bird. So it's like from water to air, let's say, this transition. And then together with them, we saw like which are the specimens that they have, which are related to the different moments, and how they are related among them. So this is actually a diagram, this bamboo structure, that shows like how they are related in time, but also in terms of the genetic information that they share. And the technique that I use is, they are frottages. I put the fossil, and then on top of the fossil a piece of paper, and then with ink you can take out the relief of the original specimen or fossil. So each one of these pieces of paper are related to one fossil in a specific. And this is one example of how I work with collections which are not necessarily related to contemporary art. So this is a collection of fossils. So it's not just finding the objects, but it's also a collaboration with the people that work there, with the scientists, with the paleontologists. And it's also a question of understanding how they work. So first you need to listen a lot to the methods that they use, and then slowly I need to understand how can I adapt that into the artwork. Yeah, the Codex Borgia, it's a very well-known document, and there are a lot of facsimiles or copies. And I got to know it when I was a child because my father had a copy of the facsimile. I could never see the original in real because it's at the Vatican Library and almost nobody can see it. So my access was always through copies or reproductions or images I found in digital archives. And this work, so the original codex has the same format as the drawing that I did, but it's a different material because the original one is painted on deer skin. So it's made out of leather. And this one is drawn on paper. In this case, what I did is I followed the biography of this book, not so much the meaning of the book itself. It's a sacred calendar and divinatory book that was used in many rituals to predict the future, to see if somebody that was going to get married was taking the good decision, or when a child was born, also this book was used. But in the case of my drawing, I follow since the moment the deer is killed, since the moment that the skin of the deer is prepared to make this very long format drawing. Then also all the drawings that are made on top of the surface. And then there is a big transformation in the moment of the Spanish conquest, because this book was stolen. There was a private collector who took it to Europe, and he was called the Cardinal Borgia. And he really didn't know what it was, so he left it in a library like for 200 years, and he thought it was from Egypt, or he had no idea what it was, what was the meaning of it. So in my drawing, I also follow the moment when the book is taken out of Mexico, then when it's traveling across the ocean, when it arrives to this library and it's like standing in the dark for 200 years, until there is someone who finally understands it and starts to say, okay, I think this is coming from this area. And through all this narration, there are also different languages. For example, there is Nahuatl, Spanish, there is also German, because, for example, Alexander von Humboldt, he also studied this document at one point. And through all these different voices, I made a video, which is also accompanying the drawing. And the video is just a pan of the drawing, and then all these voices are overlapping and going through the narration. And that's why I say that it's a meta document, because it's telling the story of itself, and it's also told in first person, so this document is pretending to be a character in a story. This work is part of the series Who Will Measure the Space, Who Will Tell Me the Time. I did it together with the Coatlicue workshop in Atzompa, Oaxaca, in Mexico, and also with the collective 1050. And everything started with the question of what is tradition and what is craft, and how can people use their historical vocabulary to create new forms, which are not necessarily related to what we understand as traditional crafts in Mexico. So we did a workshop together where we collected many different forms from the archaeological museum, but also, for example, mechanical shapes, or also pieces from the history of art. For example, the column of Brancusi, the endless column. And with all these elements, we started to create stories. So the idea is that each of these columns tells a story from the bottom to the top. And there were like a lot of prototypes, and then we were like trying to see which is the best combination for this story to happen. All these pieces were after shown at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Oaxaca. And then they had like a lot of other exhibitions where they started to appear. So they are traveling columns. Yeah. The work that we have here is the newest work in the exhibition. It was originally made for replaying live tape at the Monash University Museum in Melbourne, in Australia. And this was also part of the series of works that have to do with the history of evolution. And when I was working on the hypothesis of a tree project in Brazil, one paleontologist showed me a fossil, and he said, this is a very strange fossil because it's from something called Ediacara. And I was like, what's Ediacara? And he said it's a family of organisms that they appeared in the world. They were the first multicellular living forms. They were very successful for thousands of years, and suddenly they disappeared. And we don't know to whom they are related. We don't know why they disappeared. So there are a lot of mysteries about the Ediacaras. And he told me the only place where you can find them is in Australia. And I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. So when I was invited by the Monash University to do a work with them, I told them that I wanted to go and do research about the Ediacara fossils in the south of Australia. So I went there to the desert, and I was working with a group that goes there twice a year. So this work is the result of that field trip, and also it has a lot of the photographs that I produced on site. And I made this immersive textile environment with a series of photographs which are printed in different materials. Some of them are opaque, some of them are more transparent. And they have a series of perforations, so you can look through, or it also blocks your view. So when I was trying to understand why these organisms left a fossil trace, because they were like jellyfish, so usually these kind of organisms, they don't leave any fossil. So they say that there were some kind of layers of bacteria, that they were a bit like clots, and then they were protecting these organisms. And that's why they could leave a fossil trace, because the bacteria would make like a sort of crust that would protect them. So all these textiles also have to do with this idea of something that it's very softly protecting the organism, so it can become a fossil after thousands or millions of years. It's a textile environment that it goes away from the walls, but it tries to create its own space. This is the copy of an original stone piece that is now at the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, but it comes from Chichen Itza. And in the 19th century, many explorers were trying to make copies of these objects. And usually they would make plaster molds, but sometimes these molds were too heavy because they needed to travel in the jungle and carry them around the mountains and then bring them back in the ships. So there was one explorer, Alfred Maudsley, and he invented this technique. It's called paper squeeze. So he would take papier-mâché and put it on top of the stone of the monument with a glue, with a natural glue. And then he would take it out, and then he would have already the imprint of the original monument. Then he would take these papers back to England, and then he will make the plaster copies afterwards. So this technique was used by many other people. For example, this one is now at the Gipsformerei in Berlin, which is a place where they do official reproductions of artworks and also archaeological objects. And what is interesting is that in this piece you still see the texture of the paper that was used to make the copy. So it's not a perfect copy, it's a copy that already has the texture of the papier-mâché when it was taken out in the original site. So all the pieces in this room, they speak about these different stages of reproduction, copy, and replica of an original object. For many years, these collections of plaster copies were very important because they were also using them in the schools when people were having drawing lessons or when people were trying to understand the different motifs. But then I think with the photography, they kind of disappeared and they went into the background and they were neglected. But now they're having again a lot of importance because many of these monuments or many of these objects already disappeared, or because of global warming, the surfaces of the pyramids are eroding, so you cannot see these details so well. So these objects became, again, they have more original information than the original. So in this room, it was very important for me to work with this, with the character of these replicas and how they continue to grow in our society, but they are always taking a part of the original that the original has already lost, let's say. So we are standing in the map of Nuembag Tenochtitlan. It's an image that originally is very small, and it was printed in a letter, in the second letter that Hernán Cortés sent to the King of Spain to convince him that it was very important to conquer that continent because of the resources, because of the beauty of the landscape, and especially because of the city of Tenochtitlan. So this image has been researched by many different people. So now the theory is that the original drawing was made by an indigenous painter from Mexico. And then this image then was sent to Nuembag, where they transformed it into a wooden cut. And then it was printed in this document. So it was the first image of what is now Mexico City that was known by the whole European continent. And that's why it's so important. And for this work, I decided to change the format of this original document and to make it very, very, very big, so you could actually walk on top of the map. And it's also made with the same technique, so you can actually print from this floor. And again, it's important for me, this idea of the transformation of images, of how an original image starts to experience different transformations depending to the context, and also the aspect of reproduction, that at the end, this floor is also a printing matrix that can be used to produce more images. The technique of wood printing, it's very dear for me because I studied printmaking when I was in art school. And also all the family from my father's side, they're all printers. So I was always surrounded by this idea of reproduction of printed matter. That's why I'm also interested in artist publications, and I think it has a democratic aspect that allows the work to be accessible to a wider audience somehow. And we also have this series of costumes, which are part of the piece. They are called Chinelo Costumes, and they are originally a parody of the Spanish carnival. So the indigenous people, when the Spanish arrived, they started to do their carnivals, but they didn't allow the locals to take part in these celebrations. So the locals started to do their own costumes, but they were making like a parody of the Spanish. That's why they have these masks with the beards and with these velvet dresses. And I did originally the costumes for a performance that happened in Spain in an exhibition called Arqueológicas in Matadero. And then I had a group of dancers that were performing with this orchestra around the exhibition space. And in this case, they became more like characters that are also inhabiting the space.